In the summer of 1981, a routine city bus route through Cincinnati became the backdrop for one of the most puzzling disappearances in Ohio's criminal history. What started as an ordinary Tuesday morning shift would end with $3.6 million in federal transit funds simply vanishing without explanation. No witnesses, no forced entry, no ransom demands. Just empty safes and a trail that went cold before investigators could even establish how the money had been taken. The case baffled federal agents for 3 decades. Every lead evaporated, every theory collapsed under scrutiny, and every suspect cleared their name. It seemed destined to remain one of those perfect crimes that haunt law enforcement archives forever. But in 2011, a phone call from an unexpected source would crack open a mystery that had been sealed in silence for 30 years. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. On the morning of July 14, 1981, the Cincinnati Metropolitan Transit Authority prepared for what should have been a standard operational day. The downtown depot on 5th Street buzzed with its usual pre-shift activity as drivers checked their routes, mechanics finished final inspections, and administrative staff processed the overnight paperwork. Among the mundane tasks was a routine transfer that occurred every few weeks, the movement of accumulated federal transit subsidies from temporary holding to the main vault system. The money in question wasn't typical fare revenue. These were federal transportation grants, allocated to Cincinnati as part of a nationwide urban mobility initiative. The funds had been accumulating in a secured holding area within the depot's administrative wing, awaiting final processing and distribution across various infrastructure projects. The total amount, meticulously documented by 3 separate accounting departments, came to exactly $3,647,820. Transit Supervisor Margaret Chen had overseen similar transfers dozens of times during her 8 years with the authority. The procedure was methodical and heavily regulated. Federal guidelines required dual authorization, timed intervals, and sequential documentation at every stage. Chen arrived at the depot that morning expecting nothing more complicated than paperwork and signatures. The money was stored in a climate-controlled room adjacent to the main administrative offices. Access required 2 separate key cards held by different supervisors, and the room itself was monitored by a closed-circuit system that recorded continuously. The vault, where the funds would be transferred, sat in the basement level, behind reinforced steel doors and an electronic locking mechanism that changed its combination hourly. At 8:15 a.m., Chen met with her counterpart, Operations Manager David Kellerman, to begin the transfer protocol. Both supervisors verified their identification, signed initial documentation, and proceeded to the holding room. The security camera captured them entering at 8:18 a.m., both carrying standard transit authority briefcases and wearing their regulation identification badges. What happened next would puzzle investigators for decades. The 2 supervisors entered the holding room and found it exactly as it should be. Metal filing cabinets lined the walls, each containing carefully organized stacks of currency in sealed federal transport bags. The bags themselves were tagged with serial numbers, dates, and verification stamps from the Treasury Department. Everything appeared normal, routine, and secure. Chen and Kellerman began the standard counting procedure. Each bag was opened, its contents verified against written logs, and then resealed with new security tape bearing that day's date. The process was methodical, but not rushed. Federal regulations required precision over speed, and both supervisors had been trained to prioritize accuracy above all else. The counting continued for approximately 40 minutes. Security footage showed both individuals moving between filing cabinets, handling paperwork, and occasionally consulting with each other over documentation. At 9:02 a.m., Chen stepped out of the room briefly to retrieve additional forms from her office down the hall. Kellerman remained inside, continuing his portion of the count. Chen returned at 9:07 a.m. carrying a clipboard and several sheets of federal transfer documentation. The security camera recorded her re-entering the room, closing the door behind her, and resuming her position at the central counting table. For the next 20 minutes, both supervisors worked in apparent normalcy. At 9:28 a.m., both individuals exited the holding room together, each carrying sealed transport cases containing the verified funds. The security system logged their departure, and the room's electronic locks engaged automatically. The entire procedure had taken exactly 70 minutes, well within the standard time frame for such operations. Chen and Kellerman proceeded to the basement vault, where the final phase of the transfer would take place. The elevator ride was captured on security cameras, showing both supervisors in routine conversation, displaying no signs of distress or unusual behavior. They reached the basement level at 9:31 a.m. The vault area was a different environment entirely. Located beneath the street level, it was designed for maximum security, with reinforced concrete walls, limited access points, and redundant monitoring systems. Only 6 people in the entire transit authority held clearance to enter this space, and every entry was logged both electronically and manually. Kellerman approached the vault's electronic control panel and entered his authorization code. The system requested secondary verification, which Chen provided using her separate credentials. The massive steel door began its slow mechanical opening, revealing the secured interior where Cincinnati's transit funds were stored. Inside the vault, everything appeared exactly as it should. Organized shelving held various containers of currency, financial documents, and backup records. The lighting was bright and clinical, designed to eliminate shadows that might obscure important details during transactions. Both supervisors entered the vault carrying their sealed cases. The final phase of the transfer involved placing the new funds into designated storage containers, updating vault inventory logs, and securing all documentation according to federal protocols. This process typically required 15 to 20 minutes of careful work. At 9:47 a.m., Chen and Kellerman emerged from the vault area, their transport cases now empty, their documentation complete. Security cameras captured them walking toward the elevator, appearing satisfied with the completion of their assigned task. The vault door sealed behind them with an audible mechanical click. Both supervisors returned to the main administrative level and proceeded to their respective offices to file the completed transfer paperwork. Chen submitted her documentation to the Federal Compliance Department, while Kellerman forwarded his copies to the Accounting Division. By 10:15 a.m., the transfer was officially complete according to all regulatory requirements. The rest of July 14th proceeded without incident. Bus routes operated on schedule, maintenance continued as planned, and administrative staff processed routine paperwork. Chen and Kellerman both completed their shifts and departed the depot at their usual times. Nothing in the depot's daily operations suggested that anything unusual had occurred. It wasn't until 3 days later, during a routine federal audit, that the scope of what had happened began to emerge. On July 17th, Treasury Department Auditor Rebecca Martinez arrived at the Cincinnati depot to conduct a scheduled quarterly review of federal transit funds. These audits were standard procedure, designed to ensure compliance with federal regulations and verify the proper handling of taxpayer money. Martinez had conducted similar reviews at transit authorities across the Midwest and expected nothing more than routine paperwork verification. Martinez began her audit by requesting access to the vault and all recent transfer documentation. She reviewed Chen and Kellerman's paperwork from July 14th, noting that everything appeared to be in order according to federal guidelines. The signatures were authentic, the serial numbers matched archived records, and the timing logs were consistent with standard procedures. However, when Martinez physically inspected the vault's contents, she discovered a discrepancy that would transform a routine audit into a federal investigation. The storage containers that should have held $3.6 million in federal transit funds were completely empty. The empty containers sat in perfect rows, their metal surfaces gleaming under the vault's fluorescent lighting. Each one bore the correct labels, the proper inventory tags, and the sequential numbering that matched Martinez's federal documentation. But inside, where millions of dollars should have been stored, there was nothing but air. Martinez immediately halted her audit and requested a complete inventory of the vault's contents. Working methodically through every storage unit, every filing cabinet, and every designated holding area, she found the same result everywhere she looked. The federal transit funds that had been transferred just 3 days earlier had vanished without leaving behind a single trace. The auditor's training kicked in immediately. She sealed the vault, contacted her supervisors in Washington, and initiated lockdown procedures for the entire administrative wing of the depot. Within hours, federal agents were en route to Cincinnati, transforming what had begun as a routine compliance check into a full-scale criminal investigation. The FBI arrived at the depot on the evening of July 17th, led by Special Agent Thomas Brennan, a veteran investigator with 15 years of experience in financial crimes. Brennan had worked cases involving bank robberies, embezzlement schemes, and sophisticated fraud operations. But the Cincinnati situation presented unique challenges that immediately caught his attention. The first challenge was the complete absence of obvious criminal activity. Unlike bank robberies or armored car heists, there were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of violence, and no indication that anyone had bypassed the depot's security systems. The vault showed no damage. The electronic locks had functioned normally, and the surveillance cameras had recorded everything exactly as they should have. The second challenge was the precision of the theft. Whoever had taken the money had known exactly where it was stored, exactly when it would be transferred, and exactly how to access it without triggering any of the depot's multiple security protocols. This suggested either an inside job or a level of planning that bordered on the extraordinary. Brennan began his investigation by interviewing Chen and Kellerman, the two supervisors who had conducted the transfer. Both individuals submitted to extensive questioning, polygraph examinations, and background checks. Their financial records were scrutinized, their personal associations investigated, and their movements during the critical time period mapped in minute detail. Chen, a divorced mother of 2 who had worked for the Transit Authority since 1973, presented a profile of financial stability and professional competence. Her salary was modest but sufficient for her needs, and she had no significant debts or unusual expenses. Her background check revealed no criminal associations, no history of financial problems, and no apparent motive for theft. Kellerman's profile was similarly unremarkable. A married father of 3 who had been with the Transit Authority for 6 years, he lived in a middle-class neighborhood, drove a practical sedan, and maintained a clean financial record. His polygraph results showed no deception, and his account of the July 14th transfer remained consistent through multiple interviews. The investigation expanded to include every employee who had access to the administrative wing during the relevant time period. Bus drivers, mechanics, janitorial staff, and clerical workers were all interviewed and cleared. Security guards, maintenance personnel, and even contract workers who had been in the building were subjected to background checks and questioning. As weeks turned into months, the investigation grew increasingly complex. Federal agents analyzed the depot's security footage frame by frame, searching for any detail that might have been overlooked. They examined the vault's electronic systems, the lock mechanisms, and the surveillance equipment for signs of tampering or malfunction. They consulted with security experts, brought in forensic accountants, and even employed specialized equipment to detect trace evidence that might indicate how the theft had been accomplished. Every lead produced the same result: nothing. The money had simply vanished as if it had never existed in the first place. The case took an unexpected turn when investigators discovered that the theft had been far more sophisticated than initially realized. A detailed analysis of the depot's electronic records revealed that someone had manipulated the computer systems that tracked the movement of federal funds. The manipulation was subtle, almost invisible, but it had effectively created a paper trail showing that the money had been properly transferred and stored when, in reality, it had disappeared entirely. This discovery shifted the focus of the investigation toward individuals with technical expertise and access to the depot's computer systems. In 1981, such expertise was relatively rare, and the pool of potential suspects was small. Federal agents identified 12 individuals who possessed both the necessary computer skills and access to the relevant systems. Each of these 12 suspects was subjected to intensive investigation. Their backgrounds were examined, their financial records scrutinized, and their activities during July 1981 reconstructed in exhaustive detail. Agents traced their phone calls, mapped their travel patterns, and interviewed their friends, family members, and professional associates. The investigation produced a wealth of information, but no smoking gun. Some suspects had alibis that placed them far from Cincinnati during the critical time period. Others lacked the specific access codes needed to manipulate the computer systems. Still, others had no apparent motive for committing such a sophisticated crime. As 1981 turned into 1982, the case began to show signs of stagnation. Federal agents had interviewed hundreds of people, analyzed thousands of documents, and pursued dozens of theories, but they were no closer to solving the mystery than they had been on the day the theft was discovered. The investigation officially remained active, but resources were gradually redirected to other cases. The Cincinnati Depot implemented new security procedures, upgraded its electronic systems, and hired additional personnel to monitor federal fund transfers. The empty vault was eventually refilled with new money, and the daily operations of the Transit Authority returned to normal. But the mystery of the missing $3.6 million remained unsolved. The case file grew thicker with each passing year as agents continued to pursue occasional leads and follow up on tips from the public. However, none of these efforts produced the breakthrough that investigators desperately needed. By the mid-1980s, the case had effectively gone cold. The original investigators had been reassigned, retired, or moved to other jurisdictions. The depot's staff had largely turned over, and many of the people who had been present during the July 1981 theft were no longer with the Transit Authority. The case became a cautionary tale within federal law enforcement circles, studied in training programs as an example of a sophisticated crime that had been executed with near-perfect precision. It was referenced in academic papers, discussed at conferences, and cited in textbooks as a demonstration of how traditional investigative techniques could be defeated by careful planning and technical expertise. For 30 years, the mystery remained frozen in time, a puzzle without a solution, a crime without consequences. The money was never recovered, no charges were ever filed, and no one was ever held accountable for one of the most audacious thefts in Cincinnati's history. Then, in March 2011, everything changed. The call came into the FBI's Cincinnati field office on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Special Agent Lisa Rodriguez, who had inherited the cold case files when she transferred from Chicago 2 years earlier, almost didn't take it. The caller was elderly, his voice wavering with uncertainty, and he began with the phrase that seasoned investigators had learned to approach with skepticism. "I have information about an old crime." But something about Harold Westfield's tone made Rodriguez pause. The 73-year-old retired postal worker spoke with the careful precision of someone who had spent decades handling important documents, and his account contained details that had never been released to the public. Westfield explained that he had been a regular passenger on Cincinnati's Route 47 bus during the early 1980s. He rode the same route every morning to his job at the downtown postal facility, usually catching the 7:30 departure from the North Side terminal. On most days, the routine was unremarkable, but one morning in July 1981 had stayed with him for 30 years. Rodriguez found herself taking detailed notes as Westfield described boarding the bus on what he remembered as July 15th, the day after the federal funds had been transferred. The bus driver that morning was someone he didn't recognize, a substitute who seemed nervous and unfamiliar with the route. What struck Westfield as particularly odd was that this driver kept checking his watch and appeared to be deliberately running behind schedule. The substitute driver made several unscheduled stops along the route, claiming he needed to check his paperwork or verify directions. At each stop, he would step off the bus for several minutes, leaving the passengers waiting. Westfield, who prided himself on punctuality, became increasingly frustrated with the delays. But it was during the fourth unscheduled stop that Westfield noticed something that had puzzled him for decades. The driver stepped off the bus near an industrial loading dock and walked toward a waiting van. Through the bus window, Westfield watched as the driver briefly spoke with someone inside the van, then returned to the bus carrying what appeared to be a different clipboard than the one he had taken with him. The exchange lasted less than 2 minutes, but something about it struck Westfield as wrong. The driver's demeanor changed after the encounter. He became more focused, less nervous, and suddenly seemed to know exactly where he was going. The remaining portion of the route proceeded without delays or stops. Rodriguez asked Westfield why he had waited 30 years to report this information. His answer revealed the complexity that often surrounds cold case breakthroughs. In 1981, Westfield had mentioned the unusual bus ride to his wife, but neither of them connected it to any criminal activity. It wasn't until 2010, when Westfield's grandson was researching local history for a college project, that they learned about the transit authority theft and realized the timing might be significant. The initial skepticism that Rodriguez felt began to fade as Westfield provided additional details that aligned with the case file. He correctly described the layout of the depot, the appearance of supervisors Chen and Kellerman, and even mentioned seeing increased security presence around the administrative building during the weeks following July 14th. More importantly, Westfield had kept a detailed diary throughout the 1980s, a habit developed during his military service in Korea. The diary entry for July 15, 1981, contained a brief but precise account of the unusual bus ride, including the approximate times of the unscheduled stops and a description of the substitute driver. According to Westfield's diary, the substitute driver was a tall, thin man in his 30s with prematurely gray hair and a distinctive scar on his left hand. He spoke with what Westfield described as a slight Southern accent and seemed uncomfortable with the bus's manual transmission, grinding the gears several times during the route. Rodriguez immediately cross-referenced this description with the Transit Authority's employment records from 1981. The regular driver for Route 47 during that time period was Miguel Santos, a veteran employee who had called in sick on July 15th with what he reported as food poisoning. Santos had been interviewed during the original investigation and cleared of any involvement in the theft. The substitute driver who had replaced Santos was listed in the records as Robert Kellner, a temporary employee who had been hired through a staffing agency just 3 days before the theft occurred. According to the paperwork, Kellner had provided all the necessary documentation, passed a basic background check, and demonstrated adequate driving skills during a brief evaluation. But when Rodriguez attempted to verify Kellner's background, she discovered that his identity appeared to be fabricated. The Social Security number he had provided belonged to a deceased infant. His previous employment history could not be verified, and the address he had listed was a vacant lot in downtown Cincinnati. The staffing agency that had hired Kellner had been a small, independent operation that had gone out of business in 1983. The owner, Patricia Morse, had died in 1995, taking with her any memory of the hiring process that had brought the mysterious substitute driver into the transit authority's employ. Rodriguez realized that she was looking at the first genuine lead the case had produced in 3 decades. Someone had carefully planted a substitute driver in the transit system just days before the theft, using a false identity and fabricated credentials. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. The investigation took on new urgency as Rodriguez began reconstructing Kellner's brief employment with the transit authority. She obtained copies of his time card records, route assignments, and any incident reports that might have been filed during his short tenure. The pattern that emerged was both subtle and revealing. Kellner had worked only 4 days before the theft occurred, but during those 4 days, he had been assigned to routes that provided him with extensive access to the depot's layout and operations. His shifts had taken him past the administrative wing multiple times, through the basement loading areas, and into the maintenance sections where security protocols were more relaxed. More significantly, Kellner's route assignments had been changed at the last minute on 3 separate occasions, always by someone calling from the dispatch office and claiming that operational needs required adjustments. These changes had given him access to areas of the depot that substitute drivers would not normally see. Rodriguez tracked down the dispatch records from July 1981 and discovered that the calls authorizing these route changes had come from an internal extension, but there was no record of who had made them. The extension belonged to a shared office used by several supervisors, making it impossible to determine which individual had authorized Kellner's expanded access. The breakthrough came when Rodriguez located Frank Morrison, a retired dispatcher who had worked the overnight shift during the week of the theft. Morrison, now 81 and living in a nursing home in suburban Cincinnati, had maintained detailed personal logs throughout his career, a practice that stemmed from his experience as a military communications operator. Morrison's logs revealed that someone had accessed the dispatch office during the early morning hours of July 14th, the day of the theft. The access had occurred at 3:47 a.m., well before the start of the normal business day, and the person had remained in the office for approximately 20 minutes. The building's security system from 1981 was primitive by modern standards, consisting mainly of magnetic card readers that logged entry and exit times, but not the identity of the person using each card. Morrison's logs showed that a supervisor's access card had been used to enter the dispatch office, but there was no way to determine which supervisor's card it had been. However, Morrison remembered the incident clearly because he had been puzzled by the early morning activity. He had seen someone moving around the dispatch office through the glass partition that separated it from his work area, but the lighting had been too dim to identify the individual clearly. What Morrison could recall was that the person had spent considerable time at the computer terminal used for route assignments and scheduling. In 1981, these terminals were connected to a central mainframe that controlled the transit system's daily operations, including the coordination of special assignments like federal fund transfers. Rodriguez realized that she was looking at evidence of a sophisticated inside job that had been planned and executed with remarkable precision. Someone with access to the transit authority's internal systems had created the false identity of Robert Kellner, arranged for his hiring through a compromised staffing agency, and then used him as a tool to gather intelligence about the depot's security procedures and daily operations. The theft itself had likely been carried out by this same insider, using information gathered through Kellner's reconnaissance missions to identify the optimal timing and methodology. The substitute driver had served as both a scout and a potential scapegoat, designed to draw suspicion away from the real perpetrator. But who was the insider? And how had they managed to remain undetected for 3 decades? Rodriguez began a systematic review of every transit authority employee who had possessed the necessary access and expertise to orchestrate such a sophisticated operation. The list was surprisingly short, consisting of only 7 individuals who had both the technical knowledge to manipulate the computer systems and the administrative authority to arrange Kellner's employment and route assignments. 3 of these 7 individuals had died in the years since 1981, their secrets buried with them. 2 others had moved out of state and established new lives far from Cincinnati. The remaining 2 were still living in the area, both retired but accessible for questioning. The first was Margaret Chen, the supervisor who had conducted the original fund transfer. Rodriguez's interview with Chen revealed a woman who had aged gracefully into retirement, maintaining the same methodical precision that had characterized her professional career. Chen's memory of the July 1981 events remained sharp, and her account matched the documented evidence exactly. But Chen also provided new information that had not appeared in the original investigation files. She recalled that during the weeks leading up to the theft, there had been several unusual requests for information about federal fund transfer procedures. These requests had come from various sources within the transit authority, all claiming to need the information for training or compliance purposes. Chen had thought nothing of providing this information at the time, but in retrospect, she realized that someone had been systematically gathering intelligence about the most vulnerable aspects of the security system. The requests had been carefully spaced and had come from different departments, making it difficult to recognize the pattern. The second surviving suspect was David Kellerman, Chen's counterpart in the operations department. Rodriguez's interview with Kellerman took place in his modest ranch home in suburban Cincinnati, where he lived alone after his wife's death 2 years earlier. Kellerman's account of the July 1981 events was consistent with the documented evidence, but Rodriguez noticed subtle signs of nervousness that seemed disproportionate to the situation. He fidgeted with his hands, avoided direct eye contact, and provided answers that were technically accurate but strangely lacking in emotional content. More significantly, Kellerman's financial records from the 1980s showed several unusual patterns that had not been detected during the original investigation. In late 1981 and early 1982, he had made a series of cash deposits to his savings account, each one just below the threshold that would have required federal reporting. The deposits totaled nearly $85,000 over an 18-month period, far more than his transit authority salary could have justified. When Rodriguez questioned Kellerman about these deposits, he claimed they represented inheritance money from a deceased aunt, winnings from small-scale gambling, and proceeds from selling collectible items. However, he was unable to provide documentation for any of these claims, stating that he had not kept detailed records of such personal transactions. Rodriguez left the interview with Kellerman convinced that she had found her primary suspect, but proving his guilt after 30 years would require more than circumstantial evidence and suspicious financial patterns. She needed something concrete, something that would definitively link him to the theft and provide the foundation for criminal charges. The answer came from an unexpected source. The diary that Harold Westfield had kept throughout the 1980s contained more information than either he or Rodriguez had initially realized.